You've probably picked up your phone a few times today without even noticing. Maybe just to check the time, maybe out of boredom, maybe for no clear reason at all. And before you realized it, you were there longer than you meant to be. This happens even when there are no important messages, even when there's nothing new, even when you promised yourself you'd use it less. But this doesn't feel like a classic addiction. No one wakes up thinking, I need my phone right now. And still, the impulse shows up at the slightest silence, the smallest pause, the faintest discomfort, a line, waiting, fatigue, mild anxiety. The phone steps in as an automatic response. And maybe the most unsettling part is this. The phone isn't there just to entertain you. It's there to regulate you, to regulate boredom, anxiety, and the thoughts that start to surface when the silence lasts a little too long. This video isn't about technology or about lack of discipline. It's about what's happening internally when the phone becomes an extension of your hand and little by little of your emotional state. Because at some level, the problem isn't screen time. It's what you feel when you unlock the screen. And understanding that completely changes how this habit needs to be seen. Up next, we'll unpack why the phone becomes so hard to put down, even when it's barely giving anything back. The phone doesn't enter people's lives as a problem. It enters as a solution. In many moments, it feels useful, sometimes even necessary. The problem begins when it stops being a tool and starts becoming a refuge. Very few people notice the exact moment this shift happens. There's no clear turning point. What exists instead is an accumulation of small habits. Checking the screen as soon as you wake up, looking at notifications before going to sleep, reaching for the phone automatically whenever there's a pause. These gestures seem harmless, but they slowly train the brain to seek external stimulation whenever something internal starts to feel uncomfortable. The phone becomes a quick form of emotional interruption. Any uncomfortable sensation, mild anxiety, insecurity, loneliness, irritation, finds immediate distraction there, not to resolve what's being felt, but to suspend it. And the more often this works, the more the brain learns that discomfort doesn't need to be faced. It can be avoided. That's why so many people struggle to be without their phone even when nothing specific is happening. Silence starts to feel strange. Time slows down too much. Thoughts surface. Emotions show up. The urge to grab the device doesn't come from wanting content, but from the need to interrupt that internal contact. There's also a significant effect on attention. Constant phone use fragments experience. People get used to jumping from stimulus to stimulus, from one piece of information to another, without staying with anything for very long. This doesn't just create distraction, it creates restlessness. Staying focused on a single thing starts to require excessive effort. Over time, that restlessness is mistaken for chronic boredom. Nothing seems to hold attention for long. Books feel too slow, conversations feel drawn out. Activities without immediate stimulation lose their appeal. The phone then appears as the one thing that always works. But what's actually working is the ability to divert, to not feel, to not wait, to not sustain longer internal states. And this creates a quiet dependency, not on the technology itself, but on the momentary relief it provides. The most paradoxical part is that the more the phone is used to relieve discomfort, the more discomfort shows up when it's not around. Anxiety increases, restlessness grows, a sense of emptiness becomes more noticeable. This reinforces the cycle. The device starts to feel necessary just to stay minimally regulated, and that's where usage stops being a choice and becomes a reaction. You don't reach for the phone because you want to, you reach for it because your body asks for it, because your brain has been trained to do so. Understanding this changes the entire conversation. Because from this point on, it becomes clear that the dependency isn't in the device, it's in the emotional role it has come to occupy. And this is only the beginning. Over time, the phone starts to occupy space that used to be filled by other things. Moments of pause, for example, stop being moments of rest and become moments of consumption. Waiting turns into restlessness. Silence turns into discomfort. The absence of stimulation becomes something that needs to be fixed quickly. This changes how a person relates to their own time. The day becomes divided into small gaps that need to be filled. Any empty space feels like wasted time. The phone steps in as an immediate solution to avoid the feeling of dead time. But unfilled time isn't dead time, it's processing time. It's in those spaces that the brain organizes experiences, emotions, and thoughts. When that space is constantly interrupted, something begins to accumulate: undigested emotions, unnoticed tension, fatigue that never quite finds a name. Constant phone use blocks that contact. The person feels less in the short term but carries more in the long term. And that buildup starts to show up indirectly. Constant irritability, difficulty relaxing, a sense of always being behind, even when there's no clear reason. There's also an important impact on how a person perceives themselves. The phone enables constant comparison even when it's not conscious. Seeing other lives, routines, bodies, achievements creates a quiet reference point. Even when someone doesn't fully believe what they see, the effect still settles in. The result is a diffuse dissatisfaction, a feeling that one's own life is always slightly lacking. Not because it truly is, but because it's constantly being measured against edited versions of reality. In that sense, the phone doesn't just distract, it shifts the standard of satisfaction. Another often overlooked effect is how constant use lowers tolerance for emotional discomfort. Any negative feeling can be interrupted instantly with a few taps on the screen. This weakens the ability to stay with more difficult emotions. Mild sadness, frustration, small anxiety stop being processed and start being avoided. Over time, this creates a paradox. The person uses the phone to feel better, but becomes increasingly less capable of dealing with what they feel without it. The dependency isn't on content, it's on the regulatory function the device has taken on. That's why trying to simply reduce screen time without understanding this emotional role often fails. The issue isn't the number of minutes, it's the emptiness that shows up when the phone is removed. As long as that emptiness isn't understood, it will keep demanding something to fill it, and this is exactly where phone use starts to reveal something deeper. Not just a habit, but a pattern of avoidance. A constant attempt to avoid being alone with oneself for too long. Next, we'll look at how this becomes even more evident when we examine the impact of phone use on relationships and on how presence itself is experienced. At a certain point, excessive phone use begins to spill into relationships, not in an explosive way but subtly. The person is physically present yet absent in small moments. Their gaze splits, attention drifts, conversations are interrupted by automatic impulses to check the screen. This creates a quiet shift in the quality of presence. Relationships, romantic, family, or friendships depend on something simple and rare: sustained attention. Not intense attention all the time, but enough attention to truly notice the other person. When the phone constantly comes between people, that perception becomes fragmented. The other person begins to feel like they're competing, not with someone specific, but with something invisible. A diffuse sense of never having full attention, of there always being something more interesting happening somewhere else. Even when nothing is said, it's felt. For someone who uses their phone compulsively, this effect is rarely intentional. They're not trying to pull away. They're responding to impulses that have become automatic. The gesture of reaching for the phone happens before awareness, before choice. The problem is that the other person's body senses the absence, even when the mind tries to justify it. Over time, this changes the dynamic of the bond. Deep conversations become rarer. Shared silences turn uncomfortable. Simple moments lose their weight. Everything has to be fast, efficient, interesting enough to compete with the next notification. And this doesn't only happen with others. The person also starts to struggle to sustain presence with themselves. Being without stimulation begins to feel unsettling. Being in an environment without immediate access to the phone triggers a mild but constant anxiety. What once was companionship turns into a crutch. There's an important effect here. The phone starts to mediate how the person deals with relational discomfort. Instead of going through a difficult conversation, they distract themselves. Instead of tolerating the boredom of everyday closeness, they disconnect. Instead of sitting with an awkward silence, they fill it with stimulation. This prevents certain conflicts from being processed. Emotions stay suspended, misunderstandings accumulate, the relationship keeps functioning, but at a more superficial level, less friction, but also less intimacy. The phone offers a quick exit whenever something starts to feel emotionally demanding. Over time, this even affects how the person experiences connection. Closeness becomes associated with quick intensity, not with consistency. The brain gets used to short spikes of stimulation and starts to find bonds that require time, patience, and presence without immediate reward, strange or dull. This creates a curious paradox. The person is always connected, yet feels increasingly disconnected. There's constant exchange of messages, content, reactions, but very little space to feel truly accompanied. This emptiness doesn't show up clearly. It appears as restlessness, as difficulty relaxing next to someone, as a need to always be doing something. The phone steps in once again as a quick fix. Another often unnoticed impact is how the person deals with their own emotional discomfort within relationships. Any feeling of inadequacy, jealousy, insecurity, or frustration can be quickly diverted with stimulation. This prevents the development of internal resources to handle these emotions. Instead of learning how to move through them, the person learns how to avoid them. Over time, this avoidance creates emotional fragility. Simple emotions start to feel overwhelming. Ordinary situations trigger disproportionate anxiety. Tolerance for discomfort shrinks, and, ironically, the phone is then used to soothe an anxiety it helped create in the first place. There's also a direct impact on how the person sees themselves in relation to others. Constant comparison breeds a chronic sense of inadequacy. Life always seems less interesting than other people's. Relationships seem less intense. One's own body feels less enough. This quietly erodes self-esteem, not as an obvious crisis, but as steady wear, a feeling of never quite measuring up. The phone then becomes a tool for both distraction and validation, even when that validation is minimal. What's hardest to notice is that all of this happens without major warning signs. There's no collapse, no rupture, just a gradual shift in how attention is used, and as a result, in how life is lived. The phone doesn't just steal time, it steals micro moments of presence. And it's those micro moments that build intimacy, depth, and a sense of belonging. As long as phone use remains an automatic response to any discomfort, this loss goes unnoticed. Only when the phone isn't there does something become clear: the difficulty of simply being with another person, with silence, with one's own body. And that's when the question begins to change. It's no longer, why do I use my phone so much? It becomes, what can't I tolerate when I'm not using it? That question sets the stage for our final topic, where the conversation stops being just about addiction and starts being about what needs to be rebuilt so the phone no longer feels necessary all the time. In the end, talking about phone addiction isn't really about excessive technology use. It's about how intolerant we've become of silence, waiting, and mild emotional discomfort. The phone simply fills a space that was already fragile. For many people, staying away from the screen isn't hard because they lack willpower, but because they lack inner training. Training to sustain emotional states without interrupting them, training to move through boredom without anesthesia, training to remain present when there's no immediate stimulus. The problem isn't that the phone is always nearby, it's that it has become the first response to any internal sensation. When that happens, the device stops being a choice and becomes an emotional necessity. Breaking this pattern doesn't mean giving up your phone or living in constant surveillance of screen time. It means changing the role the phone plays. It stops being an emotional regulator and becomes a tool again. But that requires something people rarely talk about: a willingness to feel more in the short term, to feel boredom, restlessness, mild anxiety, to feel the weight of unfilled time. These sensations aren't signs that something is wrong. They're signs of readjustment. As a person begins to tolerate these states without immediately escaping, something shifts. Attention deepens, presence expands, relationships gain more depth. The relationship with oneself becomes less fragmented. This process isn't fast, and it isn't linear. There are relapses, days of excessive use, moments of real discomfort, but the axis begins to move from impulse to choice. And that may be the most important change of all. Not using the phone less out of obligation, but because you no longer need it all the time just to feel okay. When the phone stops functioning as anesthesia, it loses part of its power. And what fills the space isn't emptiness, it's contact. Contact with your own rhythm, your own body, your own emotions. Understanding the psychology behind excessive phone use isn't about control. It's about reconnection. Reconnection with something that has been slowly interrupted. The ability to be present without needing constant stimulation. If this video helped you see this habit differently, maybe the question that stays with you isn't, how much time do I spend on my phone? But what am I avoiding when I reach for my phone without thinking? When that answer starts to emerge, everything changes.